Hello and welcome to Res Digital. I'm James Batchelor, I'm UK editor of GamesIndustry.biz, and we're kicking off the first of 3 days of free talks, panels, interviews, let's plays and more in place of this year's EGX Res. We've got sessions planned from Eurogamer, Outside Xbox, Rock Paper Shotgun, Dicebreaker, VG247, US Gamer and YouTuber Jesse Cox, plus the rest of my team at GamesIndustry.biz. You can find the full schedule at res.com and you can follow along with what's happening via the Twitter and the hashtag ResDigital. To start us off today, I'm going to be hosting a panel session originally planned for the GamesIndustry.biz career fair called Becoming a Video Games Writer, for which I'm joined by my panel that has been stealthily waiting in the background. Hello, panel. There we are. Okay, I'd like you to introduce yourselves, just for those who may not know you. They probably know your words, but they may not know you. So who do we have today?
We have me, which is Rhianna Pratchett. I am a writer and narrative designer. I was formerly a game journalist very, very long time ago for PC Zone magazine, and I moved into script development 19, 20 years ago now, working on my first game, which was called Beyond Divinity, and I've done lots and lots of games since then. Mirror's Edge, Heavenly Sword, all the Overlord games, Tomb Raider, Rise of the Tomb Raider, and now I do a lot of work in film and TV development, predominantly book to screen adaptations, and also a little bit of work in comics, and a kids novel which will be coming out soon, which I can't say anything about, but I'll talk about it on my Twitter later. But yeah, I'm here to answer any questions you have.
Next.
I'm Jon Ingold of Inkle. I'm co-founder of Inkle, and I made EGX and Vault, and I've run my own company mostly so I can get to do the kind of games writing that I like doing. That's what I'm going to do. So that's fun. Anyway, 10 years before that, I was a game designer PlayStation. Before I was a math teacher or something. That was like a million years ago, but really useful right now. So that's good.
Okay, Olivia.
I'm writer, editor, and jack of all trades at Failbetter Games. While there, I've done Fallen London, Some the Sea, Some the Skies. I also freelance because I'm incapable of not working. So I've done things for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine and lots of secretly NDA'd things that I'm also very excited about. I came into games from publishing. I worked as a line editor freelance, mainly for books by Glance, but I did a lot of sci-fi and fantasy and a small amount of crime. Yeah, that's me.
Cool. You did a small amount of crime. Anyway, that's not helping. Hello, my name is Ed Fear. I am a writer and designer at Medicatonic. Most recently, I directed and co-wrote Murder by Numbers, which has just come out on Switch and Steam. And I've worked on games like Hatoful Boyfriend, The Swords of Ditto, and a number of other things, mostly in-house, but sometimes freelance as well. And for my sins, I used to be a journalist too.
Nothing wrong with journalists. Some of us are still doing that. This is the point where I quietly hope that my boss isn't tuning in watching this, because basically I want your job. You guys do what I would love to do, which is write for a video for a living, like just fictional writing, and that writing going into video games. So I guess the first kind of question would be, how did you become a video games writer? Like, what was the origins of your individual careers? We'll start with you, Rhianna.
Accidentally, kind of. Like, I never set out to be a video games writer. Like, when I was a journalist at Zone, no one ever sat me down in front of someone and said, this is our writer. Like, no, writing in games wasn't talked about. It was obviously done, but it was done by the team member who had the time and inclination to do it. It wasn't usually done by a writer, and certainly not a game specific writer. And so I didn't really know anything about it, but I gone freelance at PC Zone, and Sven from Larian contacted me because they were looking for some native English speaker to polish up their script for Beyond Divinity, and they knew I was a fan of Divine Divinity, their previous game, and they thought of me, and they knew I'd just gone freelance. So I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. This is a bit more exciting than maybe the continual round of pitching and the terrible pay that you get in games journalism. So I gave it a go, and after that I was like, oh, this seems good. Yeah, I'm going to see if I can find more work like that. And I literally went to companies whose games I like and say, hey, I'm doing this now. And do you have any work for me? And I got some work with Firefly Studios in London on Stronghold Legends. I worked on a SpongeBob game and a Pac-Man game, anything I could to get a little bit of experience, a little bit of credit. And that worked really well, actually, and there wasn't many people doing what I was doing at the time, and certainly not in a very game specific way. So I sort of created my own career and kind of built it up gradually until Heavenly Sword, and then it kind of got kicked up a notch. Heavenly Sword was one of the first early games on the PS3 and very cinematic, and I think that launched my career into kind of more cinematic style storytelling.
Olivia, what about yourself?
I either have a short version or a long version, but you're getting the long one. I actually worked in games when I was 18 in QA. I took a gap year because I'm that kind of person, and I worked for IDOS when it was still around. So I was doing Time Splitters 3 and some other games, and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which is possibly the worst job I've ever had, was QAing that. But I didn't even then realize you could work as a writer for games. Around then, I think was possibly Ree's time, a bit earlier, but it wasn't such a known job, and it wasn't so competitive, but it also didn't exist. So I then left games for almost a decade and moved into editing, because I've always been about story and writing and just doing the best it can be in that. While I was in a job as an editor, I was playing Fallen London, and that actually made me go, hang on, like there is stuff I can contribute to this. And I started actually looking to it as, what can I do within the games world? And I started writing a game called Lethophobia with a friend I'd made on Twitter. And it was using the Failbetter Story Nexus system. And while I was doing that, I was talking to Failbetter saying, look, I'm a professional editor. I don't know of any editors in the games industry. I don't know why, because it doesn't make any sense. If you've got writers, you need editors. Try me. And I was taken on freelance for a few days, and they kind of went, oh shit, this is what editors do. And I'm like, yeah. And from there, I was in games as an editor, but I'd always kind of been frank and said, look, I'm not just interested in editing because I have an ego. Editors never get any fucking credit. I want to write. And so I'd do a little bit of writing, prove I could do it, and then I get a bit more, and it's built up from there. So I don't think a lot of companies nowadays would appreciate people coming in and saying, I'll do this job if you let me do the other one. But it also sort of worked for me. Yeah. And then once I'd proven I could write, I got some freelance stuff, and that reinforced it.
Nice. Jon, what about yourself? Because you obviously, like, you both write and you kind of run a company.
Yeah, so I originally wrote, I guess I started writing games as an indie before being an indie game developer was cool. I was making text adventure games in the 2000s, which is also where Sam Barlow started out, and it's also where Emily Short started out. So quite a few of people, names you hear around today now, doing interesting stuff started in that community. But that was completely freeware stuff. Nothing was paid for. It was just a community of hackers and artists, I guess. And then at some point, I was talking to a friend who said, well, when are you going to actually go and work in games properly? So I thought, oh, okay. And I applied for a job, and I got a job at Sony Cambridge as a level designer. And I was supposed to be doing narrative stuff, but I didn't really do narrative stuff. And I ended up mostly doing Excel stuff that was nothing to do with writing at all. And it became more and more obvious to me that I wasn't going to get to do any writing until I got much, much more senior, which I wasn't sure if I was ever going to be able to do. So about that time, I met Joe Humphrey, and we left Sony and we set up Inkle together, mostly so that we could get to do the kind of working games that we actually wanted to do, because I guess the short version of it is I always wanted to write for games. I think I probably was writing for games for a long time, but until I set up my own company, no one would pay me to write for games. So I was forced to set up my own company so that I could hire this writer that I quite liked, who was me, to do the writing that I actually wanted to do. And now that's what I do. I hire myself to write games, and that seems to be the only way I can get a job. And I've been doing that for about 10 years now, which is remarkable.
Ed, yours is more the sort of route that I might be able to take some dreamy day in the future. I was working with you when you defected, but I don't remember the actual circumstances of your defection. So what was the route?
I mean, that's a dangerous question because they might have been bad circumstances. They weren't. It was fine. Well, I mean, I knew that I always wanted to make games, and I originally thought I would probably do it as a programmer, and then learned that my programming was only good to a certain extent. Really not anything that could possibly ship with a game. So yeah, so I knew I wanted to make games. So I also wanted to write. I didn't know if those two would be the same thing at that point. Yeah, I ended up getting a job at Develop Magazine, which is where I worked with yourself. And I did that partly because I wanted to get experience of like having to write on a regular cadence, which, you know, magazine writing is a good way of doing that. I thought it might help me become more productive and silence my inner critic. Spoiler alert, it didn't. So yeah, so I did that for a couple of years. I knew the whole time that I wanted, and so kind of using the opportunity to network with a lot of people and build up kind of experience and stuff like that. I'm here in London called Curve Studios, which is now Curve Digital, which is like a fairly big indie publisher. But I basically got a job there doing something else. I was technically a production technician, which is basically like the lowest on the production ladder. And basically what I did is I just kind of weaseled my way into writing. This is quite a good tip for people who work at small studios. Small studios often don't have a lot of money and people have to kind of multitask. And I remember they were working on a game and it was way over budget already, and they needed to hire a writer. And so I just piped up and I was like, how about you like let me have a go at doing it? And if it's terrible, we can still hire the writer. But if it's good, then you'll have saved some money. And they were like, oh yeah, let's do that. And luckily it wasn't terrible. And I ended up, I think, writing about 3 games while I was there. But I was still mostly focused on production and wanted to get into kind of writing full time. So that's when I moved to Medicatonic and kind of took on a fully design writing role. So yeah, I got in by kind of similar to Olivia in a way, by doing another job but saying I wanted to do the other one and kind of being a bit persistent about it.
Nice. We've been talking quite broadly so far about being a video games writer, but there are so many different positions. Like there isn't just writers. There's narrative designers. There are a bunch of other kind of disciplines that are related to writing. I wonder if we can kind of dive into those and explore like the different options for someone who just wants to write for video games, what forms that can take. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I was thinking about this, and there's one of the problems is no one knows what a narrative designer actually is, and it varies from company to company. Like at Failbetter, you cannot write without being a narrative designer just because of the way our stories are told and the system they're built in. But at other companies, that the narrative design might be handled entirely separately from the person who sits down and writes, and that person might just be doing, say, dialogue or box or something. So it's a very weird title that if you see a job application for, you kind of have to read what they're asking for rather than the title, because who knows what it means. So there's narrative designer, maybe, because that could be systems design, just like looking at numbers in the spreadsheet. There's editors. There are more of us now. I think when I joined, I was the only one in the UK. Even positions like QA and support, like if it's an indie company, Les at Failbetter is incredible, and she fields so many stuff that I would normally expect to solve, but she'll just fix it because she has access to the writing tool herself. But that's not a writing job. I don't know. Others?
I mean, I think broadly you have, I've always thought of narrative designers, if you think about writers as doing the traditional kind of the things that we think of as story bits, largely governing script, character, plot, development, that kind of thing. And narrative designers are more concerned the ways in which the story is told, the way which the story is communicated to the player. So they have one foot in the camp of writing and one foot in the camp of design, and that's usually what I've found. And I've done work as a narrative designer before, and that's kind of, in my experience, usually how it broadly falls. But as Olivia says, I've worked with some narrative designers who haven't done any writing on the project, and they've just been kind of like marshalling and corralling the other writers, but they do their own writing at home. There's also the sort of different subsections of game writing, which Olivia briefly touched upon. So things like level dialogue. So the kind of moment to moment narrative that you might have, like for example, if Lara's talking to herself during a level, or barks, which are the short lines of dialogue that come from usually AI, sometimes party members, and they're just really telling you about what's going on in the world around you, maybe what's going on in a fight. So I have been hired before specifically to write barks. So on BioShock Infinite, I helped develop the bark system for the Vox and the founders in that, and helped put that together, and wrote a lot of barks for that, and that was quite fun to do. So I didn't have anything to do with the main storyline. I had my own little space and I was doing my own thing. And so there's those kind of support writing, as well as the kind of main cinematic script. So with Rise of the Tomb Raider, we had 2 narrative designers on site, John Stafford and Cameron Suey, and John didn't do that much writing, but he sort of controlled everything. Cameron did a lot of secondary stuff, and then there was myself and Philip Gillette, who were both off site. I did a lot of the central cinematic stuff, a lot of Lara related stuff, some Lara's dad stuff. Philip did a lot of kind of polishing of scenes, a little bit of secondary narrative. So we divided it all up among us, which was kind of very useful. And we worked kind of like a virtual writer's room, which I think really kind of helped polish up the script. So that there's often roles you can get that are doing, it may seem like not the sexy part of the game, not the shiny cinematics, but it can actually be a lot of fun. Like certainly I know I'm speaking for the Tomb Raider writers, but I think we enjoyed writing our secondary narrative more than anything else, because we could be more writerly within them, and because they didn't get the eye of Sauron so much as the main cinematic script did. So we could kind of have more fun and you know, as I said, be more writerly and explore the characters the way we wanted to more. So actually secondary narrative can be a lot of fun, and so you can get a lot of jobs supporting other writers doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. I've always been intrigued about that, like particularly in the larger games, because so many games now have like, you know, lore entries and, you know, just random readable letters that you just find somewhere in the world, like those all got to come from somewhere, and presumably it's not all the same writer. So it's interesting how I kind of hear about these teams of people putting those together.
I mean, sometimes it can be the same writer. Like on the Overlord games, I wrote everything pretty much that needed writing. So that included things like weapon text, that was barks, that was level dialogue, that was cinematics as well, because I was the only one doing that. And then I think on Overlord 2, we had one narrative designer, which was a lady who defected from design and just like enjoyed working on the narrative more. But also on Overlord, because it was a smaller team, I got to do things like I co-directed the audio in the first game, and I directed the voice acting and cast it in the second game as well. So there's also a lot of things with smaller teams that you can get involved with, that you can, you know, you could just volunteer for, because someone has to do it. And if it's someone on the team, then it's usually a cheaper way of doing it, and a good way for you to get experience.
I think one of the things that I always find when people are talking about coming into the industry is that they're quite a lot of people sort of have this idea that they want to do writing in the games industry, but there isn't really that much writing actually that goes on, in a way, because everything is so distributed and integrated with everything else. Like if you go to the impression I get if you work on a big game is that somebody really very important gets to design the major story and the major story beats and what the character's about, because all of that is so tied up with what the game fundamentally is. And then right down at the bottom of that, the people filling in the lore book entries and the books are quite often quite remote contractors who don't necessarily get very much input into the game at all, because people see it as we've got this content that needs to be filled, just go away and fill it. That it's kind of almost the least important part of or it's seen as a very unimportant part of the whole pipeline of things. And then in the middle, there's this huge spectrum ranging from people who write cutscenes to people who integrate the box with the level in a way that suits the gameplay and the correct thing, which is very technical. And like writing kind of pops in and storytelling pops in all over the place and in all different aspects, and kind of everyone gets a handle on it somewhere. Even the kind of the programmers designing the interface for the level designers are having an impact on how that story is told, though they wouldn't think of themselves as writers, but ultimately they're fundamental in how the narrative comes out. So it ends up being quite a big mess of things. And I think when people come in to write for games, they sometimes think that they're going to do words, and actually it's really rare and very precious to be allowed to be able to do any words at all, and not just be kind of squeezing things into boxes that are a sort of a funny shape just to kind of fit the something else that was decided by somebody else that you're not in the room with at the time that they're talking about it.
See, that's something I've always wondered, like kind of depending on which different level you're at, like how much creative freedom do you have as a writer? Because I write in my spare time, and I write books, fiction, novellas, whatever, but I'm the only person writing. It's my story, my world, my rules, my thing. I can do whatever the hell I like because I am the only creator. When you're making games, there are so many people involved. So many people have different ideas. And yeah, you've got one kind of narrative designer or creative director or one kind of big boss kind of saying yes or no. But how much freedom do you have to kind of explore your ideas and contribute something to the game and the story and the world when you're working with so many other people?
I'll let Olivia take this one.
I was going to actually say it depends. Like in indie, you're going to have a lot more influence, but also you're probably going to be doing a lot more jobs. So while like Chris on Sun of the Skies like did the whole overview of where it was going, because there was just so much to do and so many people, you discuss the kind of sort of plot you're writing and then go away and write it. And that within that plot, you'd have immense freedom. As long as you aren't doing something that conflicts with the lore of the style, then fill your boots. It then would get reviewed to make sure you hadn't actually gone off and done something terrible. But there were basically pockets of complete freedom, but they were within kind of the sphere of make this fit the world, make it tell this sort of story. I don't think you'd get that at a larger company unless you're very senior. You can all add more.
Yeah, I think like I often see it as the game design makes spaces and then the writers come in and fill in those spaces, and sometimes those spaces are very straightforward and sometimes they're very complicated, but it totally depends on the size of the company and the complexity of the thing that you're working on and that kind of thing. I'm at really large studios, which I've never worked at, but obviously Rhianna has worked at many. I imagine that there are whole aspects of the storytelling that you can't even begin to debate or have any opinion on as the writer. There's no way you're going to give Lara Croft a sibling who gets to run around the game with you. You can't do that unless you own the whole franchise. That's I would have thought. But right down at the bottom of it, yeah, people perhaps don't pay that much attention to the very detailed parts. So maybe you can have Lara write a letter in which she casually mentions that she has a sibling and then hide it on a shelf in Croft Manor somewhere. And you might even get away with that. I don't know. But yeah, it's all really about how much can you do on your own, and then the fewer people that it impacts. It's all political, isn't it? The fewer people who need to be between you and getting your story idea out, the more likely you are to have control over it.
There are also scope as well as the design constraints, because I was thinking about this. And if you're doing voiceover, you need to be aware of the cost. So you can't do huge amounts of that, particularly if you're going to have localization, unless you're working for a massively wealthy company. So you need to be aware of not just the story constraints and the game design constraints, but also, are you going to localize this? So does this need to be translatable? Are you going to have voiceover? Like, how much dialogue do you actually want to write? Because that could suddenly go into something unaffordable. So even if you're the most powerful writer on the team and have the idea freedom, you still have to go, yes, but can we make this idea? Which in itself is probably actually quite a useful constraint.
It's funny hearing the words powerful and writer in the same sentence. I mean, certainly what I found is that it depends a lot, as we say, on the size of the team. And Jon is exactly right. Like the more levels of people that are to get in your way, basically, or that have to tick off the story, the more the further it moves, it can move away from your particular vision, and it becomes more of a story by committee thing. And so that will often happen on the bigger games, and on the smaller games you can sort of talk to the other team members a lot more easily. So something like Overlord, and I think we had like 35 to 40 people working on it. I had I had and was allowed direct contact with every level designer. So I worked with each level designer on their script. So it was very well integrated, but just done over ICQ back in the ICQ days and file convergent systems and things like that. And it worked really nicely. With the bigger games, you may, if you're a remote writer, you may meet some of the members of staff, but you won't be given that kind of access to work directly on them, on their levels, even though that's what you will be doing. As, you know, the Eye of Sauron, as I mentioned before, that's very specifically focused on the central narrative, and so that can be quite difficult to deal with. Certainly with Rise, it was just a continual headwind of feedback for like 2 years of development time on the narrative, because we opened up the script very early, which is a really painful thing for a writer to have to go through anyway. And then you're getting a lot of feedback from internal feedback, play testers, your own team, external contractors, Microsoft, Square Enix, and it's all coming at you all the time, and it's often all contrary. And there might come from some people that have experience of storytelling, but by and large it won't be, and so you have to kind of deal with all of that. And I kind of think that in games, writers live around the edges, so you kind of you get to sneak in little bits that feel more you or your vision or what you want to say, and often it's usually through the secondary narrative rather than the core narrative. And I think that's why writers tend to enjoy that a lot more. But yeah, on smaller games you can get more of your own story across. So something like Lost Words, which is coming out in a few days time on Stadia, just a tiny promote, that I've told more personal stories about kind of death and memory and the intersection of both of them, and grief and the journey of grief. So I was able to put a lot more personal stuff in there. And I did a little bit with Rise of the Tomb Raider. I put a story about my dad's experiences on the night I was born, and I sort of rolled that into Lara's dad. And that was quite a nice thing to do. And it was a memory that he said in an interview he never wanted to lose, the memory of when I was born. So I immortalized it in Rise of the Tomb Raider. So you can get these little bits, but by and large you're kind of writing to not necessarily one person's vision, but a kind of a sort of team vision. But usually the most powerful writer on the team will be the one that's the game director or the creative director. So people like Neil Druckmann, Amy Hennig, Ken Levine, they tend to be the most powerful because they also have another role, and that gives them more power.
That makes sense. And you mentioned there, obviously, and we've touched on, the size of teams you can work on, but also like kind of the possibility of working remotely and not actually being a member of the in-house studio team. Kind of wanted to explore like what the advantages and disadvantages are of being, say, an in-house writer versus being a remote writer that is brought in to kind of help with the project. Anyway,
certainly, I would say I've done a little bit of kind of external freelance writing, but most of my experience has been on like in a team and you know, on a project from kind of day one. And it's definitely I think it depends a lot on what kind of person you are and how you like to kind of how you like to work. But certainly I find that I like working on the team, you know, very basically full on. But the problem with that is that it becomes all encompassing. And so when I work on a project, it will be like I'm working on that project and only that project for 2 years, and it becomes kind of my everything. Like it's all I think about all the time. It kind of, that can kind of take a toll on you a little bit. And so certainly in the periods where I have done freelance, I've enjoyed being able to work on kind of multiple things at the same time. They can kind of act as a refresher if they're kind of, if you're doing a different kind of role, or if the games are a kind of a different genre. And also my personal experience was that I felt a little bit less attachment to them because there was a slight amount of distance. So it's very much a double-edged sword. I definitely don't think either is better than the other. To me, they're just very different experiences.
I currently do both. Sorry, I'll be quick because I know I'm talking lots. I do both, and I find, while I love the security of Failbetter and actually having colleagues I see every day and seeing something big that I can be in from the very start, freelance keeps me sane because I get to work on more than one thing. But there is a risk, I think you can become quite lonely freelance. So all my freelance work I do with my writing partner. So I still have an editor who can make sure I don't actually send out something awful, and vice versa for him. So I kind of have cheated by getting the best of both worlds both times. That's just for me though.
I guess I don't have a lot of experience of it really, because the kind of writing I do is either within Inkle, where I guess I take that game director role, or one of them alongside Joe, but he's less interested in the sort of story and the writing side of it. And so I can control and do everything, and that's great and very empowering, and it means you can do some really intricate and some really interesting things. But it also means that you spend a lot of your time firefighting other departments, or trying to make sure that this particular game system is working in a way that lets you do the narrative thing that you thought of that morning that you really want to do, that there's nobody who can tell you that you're not allowed to do, so you continue trying to do it even though it's really difficult, or something like that. And so there's quite a lot of rabbit holes, and they trap you very easily. And I think if I was working within a larger structure, if I was a writer within a AAA studio, I probably wouldn't have that risk associated with working kind of as part of a team, because there would just be limits to what I could do, and that would change my approach to it quite a lot, I think. I did a little bit of freelancing last year. I wrote a game called Over the Alps for Stave Studios, which was just the most fun that I've had. Thank you. It was the most fun I've had in years, and I think it was exactly what kind of Olivia and Ed is saying, that you get given a brief, and that's the brief, and you don't have to argue it or debate it or sell it to anybody. You just have to fill the brief. And I think I went back to those guys maybe 3 or 4 times to say, oh, I've had a little idea, could we maybe do this? And they usually said yes, because they were usually reasonable requests. But most of the time it was just writing, actually, which was really nice, and not doing anything else. And I kind of thought, well, if I could do that all the time, I would be really, really happy. But the flip side of it is that you make something that's a particular shape, and you don't get to discuss what that shape is, and you don't get to kind of vary that shape very much. And that doesn't necessarily put a limit on where you can take it and how many fireworks you can set off. So I feel like there's a balance between how much you get to enjoy what you're doing and how much you can push the ultimate product to be interesting or different or complex or diverse or whatever. And so they're kind of quite different jobs, really, in a way. But I think my experience isn't very normal, because I have sort of quite weird positions on these projects, and they're quite weird shaped projects, really, like compared to most games.
It does also depend on the freelance role, because I had one that I'm still not out, so I can't really talk much about it, but I was given a huge amount of influence, and it was terrifying because it was the first one outside Failbetter that was really influential and really good fun. So it depends on how much the person comes to you, trusts you, what they want you to do. So freelance roles vary massively, and sometimes I reckon, from at least what I've heard, they can be terrible, and sometimes genuinely brilliant, which that one was. I should also flag that being permanent is really, really relaxing, because you get sick pay and you get holidays, which you don't as a freelancer. And I know that when I was purely freelance, I went a little bit mad because I would just work for months on end without even a weekend. So unless you're incredibly disciplined, freelance on its own can be very hard.
We're already running out of time, or starting to come up towards the end of the session. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I kind of want to dive into like the bigger overall question of this session, which is what advice do you guys have for people who want to become a games writer? Like, how can they stand out? How can they progress? How can they find the opportunities they want? Obviously, like the obvious one I've heard is you download Twine and start making Twine games, because that kind of demonstrates your knowledge of branching narrative and so forth. But kind of any other advice that you guys would give?
I would say you don't have to do Twine. You could do Jon's Inkle, because it's brilliant. And I know that a lot of companies are using it in-house. That's not giving anything away, a secret about Failbetter. From my freelancing, a lot of companies are using it now. So that's a very good tool to get to grips with. Jon can talk about it.
Yeah, so Ink is an open source scripting language for creating dynamic branching narrative. It's a little bit more writer focused than I think Twine is. So you can just start writing and produce something that's playable instantly, and you don't have to worry too much about structure, and it's quite easy to edit and redraft. We like it a lot, and it's getting relatively good traction, I think, in other studios since we launched it 3-4 years ago. We're starting to get submissions from writers to Inkle in the form of Ink projects, which obviously we didn't for a while, and now that's becoming quite a regular thing. And I think at this point we wouldn't hire anyone who didn't know Ink, because I think we have the freedom to make that choice. That said, I think it's really hard, because like actually getting a job in a studio, you kind of have to have that magic moment where you approach them offering them something that they need, that they might not realize they need, but that they definitely do need, at exactly the moment that they need it, despite the fact that you have no idea who they are, what they're doing, or what they need. Like every time we've hired a writer, it's always been because somebody has appeared and I've gone, that solves this problem that I already had. I need this person now to do that thing. So from the other side of the table, it's almost impossible, I think, to pursue writing in games without just doing loads of it, trying to be diverse, trying to meet lots of people, and trying to find and just be really, really aware of for opportunities that people have. So I know some friends who've gotten quite successful freelancing gigs just by following lots of indie studios on Twitter who are doing interesting things on Screenshot Saturday, and then saying, I like your game, it looks like it really needs a writer, I'm a writer, do you need a writer? And landing gigs through sheer pluck, I think. And some of those have turned out to be really quite good. And once you've got a head of steam, then you have a name and a reputation, and the networks start to fire off. But I think that initial step, I mean, a lot of it is luck, isn't it?
I would say that for Failbetter, like someone's approached me going, should I do like a narrative design degree or a writing course? And I'm like, no, because I don't have the time to look into that stuff to see if that means you're any good. Short, finished games. Finished because finishing is the hardest thing you can ever do. And short because if I'm looking at things in my lunch hour to see whether someone's interesting, 5 to 10 minutes, I'm happy to commit. If it's like 8 hours, I'm going to play a different game. I don't have the time. And also it shows that you can do a build up and a good ending in a short piece of time, which particularly for things like Failbetter games, we have like short narratives within bigger ones. And putting them live on the internet for people to come across, because even if it's 2 years later, I'll come across an interactive fiction piece, play it and go, shit, they're good. So stuff like I'm putting on itch.io is a good place to put it. Even just tweeting things, entering competitions, at least for us, things like IF Comp. They're all good things to do, and possibly, at least on the indie side, more useful than any kind of qualification. I can't speak AAA.
I mean, I definitely agree with Jon that pluck is very important, and also, I started my career like shuffling up to studios and going, "Hey, I'm doing this now. Do you need it?" And that probably worked a lot better then than it might now, but there are a lot of ways to reach out to studios. And I always say that it's sort of threefold. It's writing, honing your skills as a writer, whether that's doing courses or just, you know, your own experimental writing, find a peer group to give feedback, just keep writing and honing your skills as a writer. Networking, obviously this is not a great time for networking at the moment, but in a kind of a normal world, you know, conferences like GDC, Reboot, Nordic Game, there are all sorts of conferences all over the world for games, and they usually have some kind of narrative component to them. Also ones that have show floors where you can actually meet developers face to face and see the games that they're working on, and there's usually a lot of indie developers and they're very good to get in with, and just playing a lot of games and actually broadening out. Don't just play games, like, you know, read books, go to theatre, listen to radio plays, watch TV, watch movies. Like, don't just make games your source of understanding of the narrative world. And, you know, speaking to tutors who in game degrees, they often find that students just, their whole kind of narrative experience is from other games. Like, you need to broaden your kind of your narrative scope out a lot more to all kinds of storytelling in all different mediums, because they all have their own unique skills and they can all kind of be borrowed and adapted for games. You just need to be interested in the world as a writer. You need to be open-minded. You need to be interested in the world. You need to be a sponge for stories and for people, and for, you know, gleaning these little ideas about how the world works and how people work. And so you've got to be broad when you're kind of taking in your narrative and influences.
I mean,
Yeah, I think. Ooh.
I was going to say it's just particularly relevant in breadth, because when you're starting off, you don't get to choose what games you write on. You say, oh yes, I'd love to. That's exactly what I like writing, to whoever gives you a chance. And then you might get to choose whether you do just sci-fi.
Yeah. I would agree with everything that's been said. I think everything is really good advice. I would just kind of stress the importance of networking. I think it is still quite a small industry, all told, and a lot of people are constant. You know, you hear of a lot of jobs coming through also because they come from people who know people, and so it's really good to kind of get out there and try and find the community. It doesn't even necessarily have to be like physically. It can be, you know, like the IGDA writers group. It could be, you know, the Writers Guild of Great Britain, BAFTA crew. You know, there are a lot of programs that get people not just of the same discipline but also different disciplines together, and that's really useful, because you need to get on someone's radar before they'll play your game or look at your resume or whatever. So I would very much recommend networking your behind off.
On networking, I'd also say do it sincerely and be aware that theoretically writers are your competitors, but they're really not. We, at least all the ones I've experienced, have tried to help me get work or improve my work. And like, games writing has improved. It's mean we've had to improve our game, but everyone I've met is kind of excited about other people being a good writer. And I think it's because we love stories, but it's very much theoretically we are competitors, like, but also we're the people who will help each other improve and get jobs. So because it's a small network, be nice, be polite, and otherwise people will talk about you for the good and for the bad. So bear that in mind.
I think we can squeeze in one very quick fire question. I'm going to spring on all of you. One game that you would give as an example of something that either is good writing, bad writing, or just something that aspiring writers can learn from. One game that you would recommend they try.
Ooh.
Oh.
I really like. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say I have a game I hate, but I won't say it because I just hate it too strongly for.
I know the game.
Sorry.
I think that's generally true, right? I think I have learned a lot from playing games I didn't like, probably more than games I do like, because when something is good, it's often effortlessly good, and it's really hard to pick out why it works or quite what works about it. Whereas stuff that could have been good but isn't, I find much more instructive, because you can get really riled up about it and you can see, oh, you could obviously have done this like that, or that really doesn't work. And that, yeah, I think I don't know. I'm generally driven by jealousy and anger are my primary creative motivators. See by me being such a raging goth. And I find that's really useful, is playing stuff that is not mediocre, but that could have been good, but doesn't know what it's trying to do, or doesn't know what it is. So I often say this in Inkle as well, like, play bad games, because people often don't bother to play bad games because they're bad, but actually bad games can be really, really helpful for working out what you want to do.
On that, it's worth trying to work out why they are bad. Like, what made this, what broke this writer? And it could just be they took out a level 3 days before launch that made the plot make sense. Like, there's all kinds of things like that going in the background. I'm still trying to think of a game that I can recommend without just saying, oh, I love Jon's games, or oh, I rewrote for this. I'll have a think.
I really like, I always use the original Psychonauts as a good example, because I think it uses level design as storytelling really well. So I think it's very good at utilizing what makes a game unique and rolling that into the narrative, using that to tell the story, using the level design to communicate character in a really smart way. And it's very funny, and it's very well written, and it's very touching in places, and it's got a really good balance. It's got very fun gameplay as well, and I think for me it just works really well. And it's got all kind of like lots and lots of clever ideas. It's really annoying the amount of clever ideas it has, but yeah, I always use it as an example of level design as storytelling. So that's probably my way off that. I always like the original BioShock for creating a sense of a world, and again, that also uses everything to kind of underline the story. So the mise en scène, the placement of bodies around the world, the advertising, the vending machines, everything is really honed to get a sense of place, and I always find that very impressive.
Outer Wilds.
Outer Wilds is also good. Yes, I enjoyed it.
It made me cry, but it requires work. So yeah.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. We have actually run out of time. Thank you so much for all of you for joining me. Thank you to everyone that tuned in. And we're going to be sharing the best insights from this panel via the GamesIndustry.biz Academy in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes out for that. For now, we're going to take a short break. I'm going to be back at 1 o'clock with Mike Bithell, developer of Thomas Was Alone, John Wick's Hex, Volume. We're going to be discussing whether or not you should go indie straight after university. We will see you then. Thank you so much, guys. That was fantastic.
Thank you.